So welcome to the panel discussion on improving resiliency of infrastructure, including buildings to prevent fatalities and mitigate damages at the TAMEST Natural Hazard Summit. As a reminder, I'm your moderator, Chandra, Womack, an engineer at Aran and Franklin Engineering. Today, I'm joined by a team of experts to have a robust conversation on this topic. Their full bios are linked available on the TAMEST website. I'll go ahead and introduce all of them and let them come on one at a time to do their presentations, and then we will open the floor up for a Q&A. First, we'll have Dr. Ian Giammanco, Lead Research Meteorologist and Senior Director for Standards and Data and Analytics, the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety, IBHS. We will also have Dr. Marc Levitan, Lead Research Engineer, National Windstorm Impact Reduction Program, National Institute of Standards and Technology. And then finally, we will have Chris Letchford, Dr. Chris Letchford, Professor and Chair, I'm going to mess this up, sorry, Rensselaer, Polytechnic Institute. Welcome all of you. We'll start with Dr. Giammanco. Thank you.
All right, I'm gonna do this talk show host style just a little bit and we get things going. First of all, it's wonderful to be back at Texas Tech, and thank you to Kishore for asking me to speak. Special place in my heart. I'm an alum here, both master's and Ph.D. I saw both of my advisors in the room, so that's a little scary. That's Richard Peterson and John Schrader, so that kind of feel like that's like a defense kind of thing. But also I met my wife, Tanya Brown Giammanco, here at the as WIN students in the IGERT program. So it's wonderful to be back. And I get to kick off our panel discussion with Marc and Chris. And our theme that you'll see within this is really trying to kind of cover all the bases and designing for the hazards, all the hazards that we face, and being able to stop that cycle of damage, disruption, and displacement we've been talking about all day that seems to just keep perpetuating itself here in the United States when we deal with really all hazards, not just necessarily weather-related ones. So we'll get going, and I'll start with just a couple examples. And Kishore actually asked me to talk about a hazard that you may not readily have thought about. Hurricanes is the good one that we think about. We're looking at structural issues due to wind damage. We know there's storm surge. That's the Bolivar Peninsula following Hurricane Ike. We've seen some damage images scroll. So those are the hazards that we immediately think of the things we have to deal with and want to mitigate against. But there's one that kind of jumps off that you might not necessarily think of that's also out there, that doesn't involve large structural failures of buildings, but something that kind of rears its head even if you just have, say, 20% of roof covering loss due to strong winds, something like that. Is the influence of water intrusion, as I try to get through these slides. There we go. But that's what that can look like. You can have a home that may only have 20% roof cover damage, but you have water intrusion through the roof system or anything else, maybe a window or door. That's a damage amplifier. You can go from a $10,000 roof replacement up to $100,000 of having to gut a home and the displacement that actually comes with it. Unfortunately, my aunt and uncle are dealing with this exact problem in South Louisiana following Hurricane Ida. They've been out of their home in a travel trailer for the better part of 8 months with 2 really large dogs, and that's not fun. And until you talk to someone who's experienced that, you don't quite grasp how frustrating that process is. And this is something where their home looked fine. I got to go see it picking up stick net instruments with the Texas Tech team. There's maybe 25% or so shingle loss. But that was enough to get them out of their home and have to deal with gutting the entire thing, all the drywall, all the floors, and 8 months of not living in their home. So that's the problem we're trying to account for, is designing and building our homes and businesses to the hazards that we face. Well, let's take a look now at severe storms. We've talked about that already this morning. I got to throw in some good time lapse of weather for us weather nerds in the audience. But we got to look at it from this angle. And where I'm going with this is a hazard that you might not think about when it comes to severe storms. And the loss picture is kind of like this. This is the insured loss data from Aon all the way through 2021. And you can see the uptick there. But really, we had that jump in 2008 where it's just a combination of all sorts of things. We had the housing crisis, recession going on. price jumps in petroleum, which leads to asphalt shingles or a petroleum byproduct. All these things happening, and just kind of we ran out of luck too, because our communities keep getting bigger and bigger. They're more spread out, but our home sizes also jumped up in there too. There's a lot more material we have to replace. But that's what the loss picture looks like for severe storms. And there's some speculation as we look ahead. Right now, we're looking at this as a $10 billion annual kind of loss problem. Over the next 10, 20 years, the chances that this becomes a $20 billion problem certainly are there, especially when we're dealing with not only what Catherine talked about this morning with loading the dice, and we've got bigger communities that are more spread out. Our targets have just grown much bigger, leading to greater probabilities that we're gonna have bad things happen. So we're gonna look at the hazards from severe convective storms as we kind of refer to it in the risk world. You can think of it in meteorological terms, severe local storms. And excluding flood, the things we're dealing with, we got hail, no stranger to that here in West Texas, wind and tornadoes also, there we go, and lightning. So what does the pie chart kind of look like as we bring up the loss picture and what actually things look like in terms of the dollars that comes with it? Well, there's hail, oh boy. We might not have thought about this one. So we're gonna talk about hail today, just for a little bit as an example of one of the things we don't necessarily think about in the way we build our structures. There's lightning, and then the wind tornado piece is also there. But in any given year, in any given year, 60 to 80% of the damage from severe thunderstorms is caused by hail. And what does hail often hit first? Well, cars and the roof. I heard the roof out there. Yes, that's correct. Hail takes on your roof, and that's what it looks like. So I had a nice video in there. It's not going to play. I was hoping I could do it. It's just kind of showing what a violent, just marginally severe hailstorm actually looks like. This was from Montana. But hail's actually really, really good at messing up roofs. And we have an awful lot of them out there. And so now, we'll take a look at the ingredients for what is a catastrophic hailstorm. So if you take an event like the San Antonio hailstorm a few years ago, that's going to produce $1 billion in loss. We know it. That is a fact. Same thing with Dallas-Fort Worth, the Metroplex. We run a hailstorm right through DFW. We are going to create $1 billion in damage for sure. So big hail, one thing. We got to have the big stuff to damage things. You can also have lots of hail and wind. Wind-driven has some of the same problems. And then I mentioned the major metro area, but the last one, vulnerable roof covers. Here's why. The United States and Canada, we like asphalt shingles. Asphalt shingles don't like hail, and we have a lot of damage. If you drive around Lubbock, and Tanya and I noticed this just yesterday, there are a lot more metal roofs that are out there. People are tired of replacing their roof cover. And I'm sure somebody, looking at Jim Ledoux over there in the Norman, Oklahoma City metro, there's probably folks who are on their third or fourth roof in the last 10 years. That's not fun to deal with. That's a lot of damage, and it's a lot of roofs that are also going into landfills as well. So we have a problem there. And some of our standards for dealing with the roof cover performance, especially for asphalt shingles, were rooted in science from years and years ago. So we have to keep up with that. But here's kind of a picture of what the loss actually looks like. One of our single large insurers paid out $280 million on the 12 most active hail days from 2018 to 2020. That's a lot. There's a lot there. If we kind of go ahead just a touch and kind of look at some of the other statistics with this one's interesting. 87% of the claims occurred at radar estimated hail sizes below 2 inches. Now, 2 inches, that's big hail. Anything over that's pretty stout stuff. But below that, now there are errors built in here. We can do something about that. We think we have some tools to tackle this problem. And so by using better roofing products that can withstand that, 87% at sub 2-inch hail sizes, we have a chance for some savings. We can not only stop some of the constant replacement of roofs, we can start to bring down that loss curve that we showed in the Aon data year after year that we continually see. So this is where I wanted to kind of leave things, with just the theme of getting the tools to do this. So at IBHS, one of our big efforts was, one, get a better testing protocol that actually helped assess the relative performance of shingles. So we can't think asphalt shingles are all bad. when we first started this, there was a lot of red dots on the chart there. And I'm going to look at Ann Cope, our chief engineer back there. And Ann, we didn't know how this was going to go. And Ann knows I was one of the most pessimistic people. Tanya was kind of in the middle as she kind of developed the metric to do this, to see if manufacturers would respond as a nudge factor to get better products. Well, sure enough, by the second time we released this, there's a lot more green dots of better performing products. And so our goal was to simply provide information that presented good, accurate information about product performance. And the nudge factor was such that we raised the bar for the manufacturers. So it's actually kind of a model there for how one of those nudge factors to get better materials. But we can turn this same theme over toward thinking about building codes. You know, all the great engineering and science that's gotten into modern codes, we've seen it perform. That's a tool we've got. Obviously, manufacturers, that's another one. Incentive programs, grant programs, all of those things, we have more and more tools that are becoming available. We just have to find the nudge factors, and it's a human kind of societal, sociological problem. How do we put them together? And as I think Jamie mentioned, there's that window of time where people want to do stuff after sometimes a bad event. And for us at IBHS, we often point to our Fortified Home program, which came about the biggest success story in coastal Alabama in terms of windstorm resilience right after the 04-05 hurricane season. We had that window of time where people wanted to work together to develop a solution for them, one, to create a viable private insurance market, but to bring down the risk in those coastal counties to hurricanes and the hazards they bring. So I'll stop there and turn things over to Mark and Chris as we kind of work our way through this panel. They'll take you into some more details about other ways we can do this for hazards such as tornadoes, and what are the tools we have to tackle this.
Thank you, Ian. That's a tough act to follow. I will one-up you, or maybe two-up you, with 4 degrees from Texas Tech. Dual degree undergraduate, architecture, civil, master's, and Ph.D., although I think Patya followed the same route as I did. If we can have my first slide, please. Let me first, and if you'll indulge me a minute here, we heard a lot this morning about the impact of the WIN program here at Texas Tech and how it impacted the university and created a model as it moving towards a research institution. So just briefly about some of the individuals and leaders in their fields across there. But you see under my title here, the Lead Research Engineer National Windstorm Impact Reduction Program. So the WIN program here, and Kishore in particular, was one of the persons who pushed very hard, build a coalition, tried to get that program modeled off the National Earthquake Hazard Reduction Program for many years, worked through, eventually got that approved through Congress, 2004. It's a 4 federal agency program, NIST, NOAA, NSF, FEMA, to work with the mission to create major measurable losses in terms of loss of life and loss of property in windstorms. And so Kishore played a key role in developing the NWERP program. And then he came back, and when he was a rotator at NSF, at that point in time, the NWERP was actually, the lead agency was the Office of Science and Technology Policy, an odd place for a program like that, but that's the way it was set up. And Kishore was the head of the Windstorm Working Group when he was at NSF for several years. And so if there wouldn't have been an NWERP program, I wouldn't have got hired at NIST, and I wouldn't have been able to do the things that I've been able to do there. So just another one of the many, many impacts of the WIN program in Kishore here. So I'm going to talk today about tornadoes and improving our resilience. And one of the key things is, and of course I'm obviously preaching to the choir somewhat here, but maybe not as much as you think. And so we're going to talk about some successes that we've had in a future direction here for tornadoes. But when we first brought this idea to design for tornadoes to the ASCE7 Wind Load Subcommittee. So now there's a group of experts in wind, and if you think there's going to be a group that's going to be pretty interested in designing for tornadoes and think that it's a good thing to do, you imagine that. And I thought that wouldn't be our first hurdle, but the first meeting that we had in 2018 for the 2022 cycle, January. And we said, hey, we did this big investigation of the Joplin tornado. We've been developing a lot of work to develop design provisions and methodologies and new hazard maps for tornadoes. And we brought this and we discussed it with ASCE 7 leadership ahead of time. Great idea, we'll move for this. And we said, hey, we're gonna set up and create a new tornado task committee within the wind load subcommittee. And there was a lot of pushback. Why do we need design for tornadoes? Aren't they too rare? There's nothing we can do about them. It's gonna be too expensive. And this is the wind load subcommittee. And we took a straw poll at the end. It was kind of frustrating for me. I thought that was gonna be, I know we were gonna have problems later on, but I thought that was gonna be the first easy hurdle. We took a straw poll in the first meeting, and we had sort of three options. One, should tornado loads be in the body of the ASCE standard? The second option, should they be in an appendix, as an optional appendix, or should they just be in a design guide? And we barely eked out, I think with the recount with one or two people, is your hand raised or not, whatever, a plurality where being in the body of the standard won by like 1 or 2 votes over that. It wasn't even a majority, it was barely a plurality. But that was enough legs to at least give us the go-ahead within the ASCE 7 standard. So the idea of saying maybe this group's obvious, oh, we should be designing for tornadoes, it was not obvious even to the wind engineering community. So there's some common misperceptions. And the first I start out with, that the tornadoes are too rare, that the losses are small compared with others' hazards, there's nothing we can do about them, inadequate knowledge, we'd have to live underground or in concrete bunkers, it's too expensive. A lot of these are driven by the perceptions, I think, that are shaped by the few violent tornadoes per year that make the headlines, or once every couple of years. Sometimes we go into some seasons that are a little bit less. So if we look at our number of reported tornadoes per year, once we've stabilized, like, oh my gosh, climate change. No, we just didn't know how to report them. We didn't have population that didn't get hit. We didn't have radar networks and cell phone networks and spotter networks and all sorts of things, whatever. And so basically, since the mid-90s, with something stable, a lot of intra-year variability, but something like 1,250 reported tornadoes per year. Of course, population bias, well known. Many tornadoes, especially in rural areas, go unreported. If we look at where tornadoes occur, and these aren't tracks, these are just the points, obviously in all 50 states, but the vast majority east of the Continental Divide, with the most intense in the central U.S. and some in the southeast. Some people may be surprised that we have the number of tornadoes that we have on the coast and even going up into New England. We see some areas in Appalachia here and up in far up into upper New England. Maybe there's less tornadoes, there's a lot less population in some of those areas. Maybe it's some reporting issues there as well. So we don't know, but we do have pretty much, if you're east of the Rockies, we've got a lot of tornadoes. What's our distribution of the tornadoes? They're mostly all EF0s and EF1s. It's a pretty small numbers. EF5, by the time we get up to EF5, we have less than 1 per year. The vast majority of violent tornadoes are uncommon. The vast majority of all tornadoes are less than EF2. We see those statistics there. That's a little bit biased because we know there's, not only is there undercounting of tornadoes, there's underreporting of strength because it's got to hit a building, and so some of the lower intensity tornadoes get rated EF0 because it's out in the field someplace and it doesn't have something, or there's only a barn, and we can only get EF1 level wind speeds out of a barn or something. And so there is actually some shift to this. But that's what we have in terms of our climatology. If we look at the impacts, tornado fatalities, there's about 5,600 from 1950 through 2011 using NOAA statistics when we did that part of the study. Fatalities from tornadoes are greater than hurricane and earthquake fatalities. We designed for hurricanes and earthquakes, right? We don't design for those. Tornado fatalities overwhelmingly occur inside of buildings. And so tornado fatalities are a buildings problem. We saw some different statistics here. This is specific to, from the Insurance Service Organization, specific to catastrophe losses. Now here they're showing events including tornadoes, so tornadoes and tornadic storms. Now, of course, that includes hail and flood mixed in, et cetera. But hurricane also includes some of those flooding. Most flooding is public, and that was not be included in here. There are some flood losses that are private sector, et cetera. But anyway, tornadoes and tornadic storms do have a big effect on our insured losses. The plot that Ian showed, where were the big spikes? 2011, that's all tornado, right? That wasn't hail, that kind of thing. If we look at the losses, it's all the big tornadoes that drive the losses. No, the big tornadoes don't drive the losses. On an individual tornado, if we look at the black line here, this is over the average loss per individual tornado. Yeah, there's about almost an order of magnitude increase in dollar losses. This is in log scale on plots in millions. per increase in EF number. But if we aggregate over all EF zeros and over all EF ones, except for the EF zeros, we have almost the same level. And why is that? Well, there's less than one EF5 tornado per year. You know, we got a couple of hundred EF1 tornadoes, we got 100 EF2s, we got a couple of dozen EF3s, we got half a dozen EF4s. And so just the larger numbers of these smaller tornadoes drive it to where those losses. So the majority of losses are EF3 tornadoes or less. And it's even more than that because we're ascribing all the EF5 losses to EF5 right here. An EF5 tornado, only a small percentage of the total area swept by the EF5 tornado actually experiences EF5 winds. Most of the area in the Joplin tornado was about 72% of the area of the Joplin tornado experienced EF2 level and 0 winds. So a lot of the losses that are ascribed to EF5 are from parts of the tornado that are not from EF5. So if we can do something about EF3, especially EF2, 1, 0, whatever, we can take a big chunk out of losses. Okay. So kind of the genesis of the new tornado load methodologies, we had a big technical investigation at NIST of the Joplin tornado, a series of recommendations for tornado hazard characteristic, design and construction of buildings and shelters, emergency communications and warnings. At NIST, this was done under our National Construction Safety Team authority, this investigation. That's sort of like NTSB, but for buildings. It was an authority given to NIST after the World Trade Center disaster when it wasn't clear who had the authority to study building collapse. One thing is, this was our third NCST investigation. We have another one going on right now for Hurricane Maria and a new one for the Champlain Towers South. And Tanya has the joy of getting to lead the efforts on those and track those. But when we write these recommendations, we're on the hook to Congress, and we have to report every single year until we get these recommendations done. And so 10 years on after the Joplin tornado, we're still in the thick of it, right? We just made some good progress recently, but we'll be doing this for more. We're still have World Trade Center work coming out. ASCE published a draft for public comment for prevention of disproportionate collapse. That's a result of the World Trade Center work done at NIST. And so this was followed with intensive work, 6 years worth of R&D. We developed the first ever probabilistic tornado hazard maps that include size effects. So your tornado risk is very heavily dependent on the plan area, size, and shape of the building that you're dealing with. And if you think about that, most tornadoes, yes, we can get tornadoes that are a mile wide, et cetera, and larger than a building. Most tornadoes are 20, 30, 50 yards wide, whatever. They're smaller than a lot of our buildings, right? I mean, a lot of times you go down to the Walmart, the building could be 800 feet long, or whatever. So those tornadoes, and so the risk that you have for the tornado, and what we'll see is we have a whole series of wind speed maps that were developed. If you go from a small building, or just even a very small building, a house size, or even a point size, like a communications tower or something, up to a large facility, for the same return period, your wind speed risk can be 40 or 50 miles per hour different at the same return period based on the plan area, size, and shape of your building or facility. So anyway, we did a lot of R&D on that. We looked to account for, and it's not just the wind speed is different in tornadoes and the different climatology. Tornadoes have so many other differences, right? The velocity profile is totally different. We have higher wind speeds near the ground, not like a boundary layer wind speed where we have higher wind speeds aloft. We worked with the mobile radar community. We'll hear some about this on Wednesday in the conference. There's most of the, even though with the mobile research radars, they've got a lot of those have captured tornadoes. Mostly that's higher up in the atmosphere. There's only about a couple of dozen records where we actually have profiles that go down near the ground. And with those couple of dozen, there's a lot, each individual one is shown here. There's a lot of scatter here, but this line in the middle is the median line. Looks pretty uniform, maybe a little bit of increase right down near the ground. We ended up using a sort of a uniform profile that is a slight decrease, but totally different. We have very strong updrafts in the tornado, changes the aerodynamics of the roof. So we end up with a different pressure pattern. It's not like we just take a different wind speed and multiply by the same effects. When we developed the tornado load methodology, we used the wind load framework, which a lot of that, Kishore led the ASCE7 for many years and the ANSI A58.1 before that, and developed and brought a lot of the work of wind engineering to develop the wind load standard that we have now. A lot of it's based on his work and work done here at Texas Tech, other legacy effects there. But so we tried to account for and modify, so almost every single parameter except the ground elevation factor, the air density above the ground doesn't depending on your air elevation, that doesn't change just because it's a tornado or a hurricane. But we did all those changes, developed all that R&D, developed tornado load maps, tornado methodologies. We worked very hard. We got that successfully into ASCE 7. People in the room here, a lot of people in the room participated in that. A lot of people are going to be in the conference. We had a huge committee that worked on that. So a big success right there. We've got a new chapter 32 on tornado loads. So just a very quick summary. Again, we'll see more about this in the conference. It applies to risk category 3 and 4 buildings in the tornado-prone region, and you can see why. I showed you where tornadoes occur. You can see why that's our tornado-prone region. Risk category 3 is sort of assembly occupancies in schools and nursing homes. Risk category 4 is our hospital, fire, police, those facilities. The tornado speeds we're designing for are kind of EF0 through EF2, depending upon your risk category, location, and plant size. Why are we doing that? Because we're meeting the reliability targets in ASCE 7 for hazards. We use the same reliability for wind loads as we use for our tornado loads. At the return periods that we would use, and it works out that we could use the same return periods for our tornado loads to meet those reliability targets. It didn't have to work out that way, but the way that we picked the nominal values of the parameters, it worked out that we could use those, and that just makes it easier from a risk communication standpoint and everything. But basically, that's given us the same reliability. Risk category 2 buildings, which is school, which is your homes and shops and businesses and things like that. That's most buildings. At 700 years, tornadoes are too infrequent. Tornado loads would not control over wind loads. The tornado speeds are too low. We can design for we're designing for the most common tornadoes, not the most intense. If we want to design for the most intense, we put in a storm shelter or a FEMA safe room. Those are designed for the most intense tornadoes. Tornado loads can increase even at these much more modest speeds of EF0 through 2 because of all these other factors that are different and mostly higher for tornado. The loads on the building can increase sometimes even more than 100%. However, that's usually increasing the load is in the field of the roof or on the leeward wall, in places where the loads are somewhat lower to begin with. And so, fortunately, we're not driving similar costs. Storm shelters, your costs go up a lot more because you're designing them for 250 miles per hour or something. You're not designing for that. But your construction costs, we did work with our applied economics office, generally less than 0.25% or even smaller than that. We just finished a recent study on that, again, with our applied economics office. And so how are we going to get this, how are we going to implement this work? We add tornado loads to the 2024 IPC. We were just at the code hearings a month ago up in Rochester, and the proposal to add ASCE 7 tornado loads passed the IBC Structural Committee 14-0. Not only that, there was not a single person who stood up at the microphone in opposition, not one. Now, I can say we did a great job. I think Mother Nature also helped with the December tornado outbreak and 2 big outbreaks in March, and et cetera, but we didn't have one person stand up. Now, we still have to get through public comments, but the question is also to get this implementation, why do we have to wait until 24, even assuming approval? The fact that we got got it through at least the code committee is the first step, means it's probably likely that it'll get into the 2024. But why do we need to wait? It's published in the standard. Federal, state, and local government, they adopt things that are above code all the time. Hey, your community's in the flood, participates in the NFIP. If you adopt an extra foot of requirement in your local ordinance, an extra foot of freeboard, hey, you're going to get a discount on your flood insurance rates, right? That's going above and beyond code minimum. The federal government, the GSA, when they build a building, they have to follow these extra guidelines to prevent progressive collapse. FEMA, they have what they call funding criteria, but it's actually additional technical criteria above and beyond the building code and the storm shelter standard if you want to get funding from FEMA to build your safe room. And so we have above code requirements all the time. I've been advocating, we've had a lot of meetings lately with different federal agencies and things. Hey, why doesn't the federal government start to go ahead and apply requirements, develop requirements for using design for tornado? We're going to rebuild. We're going to give a lot of money that we fund for the Infrastructure and Jobs Act. We're going to do a lot of construction. We're going to do a lot of rebuilding in Kentucky and other places. The state of Alabama and Illinois, they adopted requirements for ICC 500 storm shelters before that even appeared in the building code, right? So we have this ability to do these sorts of things. So with that, I'll go ahead and stop and turn it over to Chris for our next speaker. And lastly, while he's coming up, I'll say there's another impact that Kishore had. Our speaker earlier, Andrea Jackman, talked about that the success of the hurricane evacuation from New Orleans. And Kishore actually played a huge role in that. If we have time for the questions, he doesn't even know that, but I'll clue you in if we have time.
Thank you for all staying so long. It's a pleasure to be here. I think Kishore wanted someone with a deeply southern accent to present, and so here I am. I first came to Texas Tech in 1991 on sabbatical from Australia, and I was enticed back to work here for 8 years, 99 to 2007. So I have, and my children in particular, have fond memories of Lubbock. My job is to stand between now and your visit, or if you haven't been out to the site, you really ought to go out to the site. It's an amazing change over the time that I've worked here. So I'll try and do that rapidly so we have time for questions. I'm going the wrong way. Oh. No. This is not my talk. Anyway, what I wanted to really talk to you about were, in fact, I think 3 problems about the future. I'm here to really try and take us into the future. My first slide would have been about the past, and I'm sorry for Andrea, but it mentioned FEMA and HAZUS as the past. The second slide was about the present, and that is, we've heard from Jamie about INCORE, from the NIST Centre, and the other slide about the present would have been about the SIM Centre, which we heard from Tracy. So these are 2 products that are really looking at resiliency from a point of view now, not from the large aggregate that HAZUS, as my understanding, looked at, but much more on a parcel level, and we saw some of that obviously in Tracy and Jamie's talk. And so that was really what I regard as the present. And the future, well, that's very hard to predict. Clearly, we can continue on that disaggregation of getting to finer and finer particles. But I was really going to talk to you about the 3 issues that I think are related to resiliency into the future. And the first of those is funding. How do we actually fund resilient communities? What's going to be required to fund resilient communities? The second topic was really going to be about social justice. Who actually benefits from resiliency? And this we heard a little bit about from Jamie in terms of wealth discrepancy and wealth and income discrepancy and how that impacts resilient communities. Okay? And the third was clearly related to what Catherine talked about this morning, climate change. She talked about us driving as looking in the rearview mirror. I think that's the wrong analogy. I think we are driving with a blindfold. It's very clear we all can see the curve ahead, in my view. Okay, I think we're driving with a blindfold on. So that's the sort of issues that I think are related to the future. Funding, clearly. Social justice, who's benefiting from resiliency? And clearly the world is changing around us in many ways which we, I think, have a better understanding of, but not a perfect understanding of. So I think that gives us plenty of time for questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. I think first and foremost, we have to know why Kishore had impact on the hurricane evacuations. You're gonna have to tie a bow on that one right now.
So, as we saw and we heard this morning, Kishore and his colleagues, Joe and Ernie and Jim McDonald, they had this, and Richard, they had this idea that it's not just engineering, it's not just calculations, whatever. Hey, we've got to reach out and get to atmospheric science, we've got to reach out to economics, we've got to reach out to the mechanical engineers and the other departments And so I was here as it was transitioning. I started in 1980 and left in 93, and I guess it was IDR and WERC, and the name changed along the way several times to become the National Wind Institute. But I got to see that, and so in addition to all the formal education I got in wind engineering, concrete, and other classes I got, I just sort of absorbed and saw what was going and how sort of the whole is more than the sum of the parts. And when I left here, I got a faculty position at Louisiana State University, and they had nobody doing anything in wind, despite being on the coast and having a lot of hazards. But as I was there and started to get to know people, they had a big program in coastal sciences, and they had some folks in sociology that were studying like sociological aspects of disasters and evacuations. And they had a guy in mechanical engineering at wind tunnel that were doing some not wind engineering, but doing some fluid mechanics. And there's a bunch of different people across campus, and I started keeping a file. And once I got my tenure there, it was like, hey, I saw what was done here to put together a center. So I got a bunch of my colleagues together. We put together the LSU Hurricane Center, which for a time was one of the premier interdisciplinary research units on that campus. One of the things that one of the first major projects we did is a national study of hurricane evacuation procedures across the country, of course, the Gulf and Atlantic coasts. Federal Highway actually bought about 5,000 copies of the report and distributed it to state DOTs and other things. But as part of that work, we identified a lot of work with contraflow. We had a young professor there, Brian Wolshon, who was a young transportation engineering professor, and I asked him, Brian, what do we know in the literature? What do we know about evacuation and contraflow and all that sort of stuff? And there was nothing at that time, around 2000, in the literature. There was some gray literature. There was no formal academic work. All the work in evacuation, Draybeck and others, is all sociology and behavioral stuff and everything else. There was nothing in the formal, in the transportation, except for like nuclear stuff and things like that. And so we got started actually doing some of that work, and that became actually the foundation of his career. Led the big TRB committee. He's got a transportation center. We were doing a lot of work. We were doing a lot of modeling. Hurricane Ivan comes along in 2004. They tried to evacuate New Orleans. It's the first time they tried to put the contraflow plan into effect. It doesn't work. They waited too late. They have the wrong places. They had convergence zones and stuff. They're dumping people off in the wrong places. So Brian gets on the statewide committee that works for the next year to fix the problems. When they go back in 2005, the hurricane evacuation contraflow worked like a gem. So it never would have happened without Kishore. Right? Chain of events right there. All the way
circle. Full circle. Well, he's had a tremendous impact on a lot of people in a lot of different ways, so not surprising. Getting back to the presentation, Ian, Mark, but the two of you kind of had some overlapping ideas, and I wanted to just throw this out there. So the EF2 tornadoes, 97% or less than EF2 or less. So if we can address damages from those EF2 tornadoes, and I know that the fortified, if you're designing to a fortified standard and you're doing continuous load path and you're getting that roof on there, you're pretty much going to hit, that 97%. So do you have any recommendation on when Mark's putting this, this IBC 2024 together? I mean, how can we incorporate these techniques that we already have developed into a standard like that?
Oh, that's so, the first one, you gotta want it. Unfortunately, a lot of the states that deal with the tornado, really severe convective storm hazards, don't have statewide building codes. And there are municipalities, actually unincorporated counties, that have no code.
Correct.
Probably one of the most frustrating parts of maybe all of our jobs is to observe that. So step one is to use the tools we have, for sure. And then the next piece is local communities, and this is why we love to talk about coastal Alabama, because it was a local effort that kind of changed the world for them. They up and decided they wanted to do this, so others can do the same. And from a fortified perspective, some of the obviously the same building techniques that we know work. I mean, there's decades of work, not only from here at Tech, all the academic institutions, IBHS, others, the government labs that have gone into this. We have a lot of tools in the toolbox. We just got to find the nudges to make it work almost at the policy side to get something in places that honestly don't have much. Mark, I'll let you jump in with some more.
Yeah, you're right. I think, and that's a starting point. And as I presented, at least based on meeting ASC 7 reliability targets, we're only covering risk category 3 and 4, so that's not home. Now, you certainly may ask the question, and it has been asked, maybe we shouldn't have started with ASC 7 reliability targets. Maybe tornado, we should have looked at different reliability. That was a bridge too far for the last edition, so at least this is where we're at right now. That's certainly a good conversation starter to think about for the future. Now that we've just got this in, just in the last few weeks, we kind of kicked off and started our next phase of the work is how can we take what we know more about tornadoes and tornado loads and start to bring that down into risk category 2. What things from the fortified program, what things from FEMA P804 and other documents, what techniques that we know work, how are those going to be cost effective? How are we going to sell those? Yeah, there'll be a NIST FEMA design guide eventually, more focused on tornado. But again, that's going to be voluntary. That's going to have a small amount of pickup. How do we do cost-benefit studies to quantify these things, to be able to get them sold, to get them into the IBC and the IRC for single-family residential, multifamily residential, some of the other smaller kind of buildings that aren't going to be covered through the ASC set. So that's kind of our next phase that we're really just kind of kicking off and starting some informal working groups. I only actually just had a kickoff meeting last week with our applied economics. I've already recruited a few others here in the meeting. If anybody's interested in kind of that, just let me know. I've got my cards here, or to pass it out, whatever. That's going to be our next big battle over the next few years. One of the things, and actually visiting with Tanya over the last month, we know one of the big vulnerabilities is garage doors for residents.
Huge.
You lose that garage door, there's a massive correlation between losing the roof above the garage and that damage progressing to the rest of the house. You blow out the other walls. Maybe that's an easier case study, a fix, whatever. Maybe we can, hopefully we've got a separate little working group that we're kind of starting that's a bit more focused on that, even though while we're trying to get our arms around the bigger picture right here. And maybe that's something that we can work on and get something as a targeted item for the 27 bill.
I'd say the roof and garage doors, one also presents you the retrofit options. So the things that are they're doable from a moderate kind of effort as opposed to, a load path in a retrofit scenario.
It's a big lift, yeah.
It's a very big lift and it's very expensive. But re-roofs, great time to do something. And the garage door problem, lastly, one little point to make was Kentucky on the Mayfield tornado. Kentucky had a statewide code. Unfortunately, they had a very old building stock. And so what we're observing is the poor performance of structures in these events that are just rooted in a time in which we didn't have these tools. And unfortunately, we watched this play out really terribly. But now we know we have some tools. We have to figure out, one, can we solve this on the communities of tomorrow using the code tools that we know we have? And then how do we solve the retrofit problem, whether it be through grants, incentives, whatever those nudge factors are.
Well, that is one of the things that is helping in the future is that with these grant mitigation programs, we are building at least to the current standard and trying to prevent the same damages from happening that we just experienced so that we have our communities come back better, faster, stronger. And that kind of feeds into, what Chris was saying, we have to look at the future and understand where we came from, but always be moving, forward. And all of our efforts today have really been focused on our U.S.-based, disasters. And how is this research that we're applying, can we apply this in other parts of the world? Is there any collaboration with any other agencies outside of the United States that's really doing this kind of work? Or are we just, leading edge and developing this? Because these hazards are not just in the United States. Anyone?
Chris is looking at me. I'll let him take it.
I was looking at Mark.
Should have addressed it to someone, sorry.
So, I have not been in Australia for many years, so I don't really follow what's going there. But I know the Europeans are very advanced in resiliency, particularly flooding. Probably after their severe windstorms, their biggest problem, but they certainly seem to be well advanced in that area. In Australia, Geosciences Australia led a program a bit like what's happening in Incore and SimCenter in terms of parcel-based modelling. Hail is a big problem in Australia, and we're doing a lot of work in hail on the East Coast. But, you know, I think we're not alone in the problem, and more collaboration would be good.
Yes.
Yeah, on the hail side, I have to really give a hat tip to the European community who really led the way. Whereas here in the United States, hail had kind of mired in stagnation since the late 70s, early 80s. But Europe, they don't see the massive hail events like we do, say, here in the Southern Plains. But they have the population density is so much, cram more people in there. So the massive losses are very common. Despite a frequency of event and severity that's actually lower than what we see here in the United States. And they were very proactive with research, mitigation actions. They're even looking at smart building technology to help reduce hail damage to windows, things like that, as well as unified loss data sets as well. And Australia too, from a loss perspective, having those good unified data structures to explore loss is something that they do very well.
Very good.
Tornado front. Of course, the U.S. experiences more and more intense tornadoes than any place else in the world. But Canada, I think there's some talk about maybe at some point moving some of the tornado provisions. Maybe I thought there was maybe some discussion that they may start out with a supplement or an appendix or something like that. Certainly, other parts of the world have that. I've been doing a series of briefings for the Nuclear Energy Agency, that's an international organization. They're worried about tornadoes, of course, worldwide as a hazard for nuclear power plants. So some of the loading provisions, of course, the hazard. Now, some of the techniques of how we develop the hazard maps and the spatiality effects and those sort of things are relevant. And so folks will be looking at that. But a lot of the mechanics of the different loading mechanisms, because the wind characteristics and the wind structure characteristics and the building aerodynamics are different in a tornado based on the different flow characteristics. So some of that is actually transportable, and as we start to get more publications out and stuff, a lot of this work was being done as we're finishing up the R&D and getting it just because of timing to get it into ASC 7, whatever. So we're just starting to, a lot of the publications are just starting to come out now. Over the next couple of years, we'll have a lot of that work will be documented and make it somewhat more thorough.
Okay. Yes, ma'am.
So I'm going to ask you a question that we've been trying to explore what we call micro mitigation. In that, what are some small things that people can do that aren't so expensive that can protect them or protect their property? Have you given some thought? Because all of the things we've described are sort of big lifts with large budgets. Have you thought about, are there things we can communicate to people that are fairly low budget but highly effective?
Cut down trees.
Okay.
I mean, there are small things. We have lots of guidance on some of those, and in terms of mass risk reduction, if you just break it into pie chart, yeah, they are small things like caulking windows and doors, things like that. To
The
be honest,
landscaping too, right? There's some landscaping edits that you can make.
So wildfire is a place where there's a chance there that has more of those DIY things that give you a lot more risk reduction for your just physical sweat equity kind of things. But there's a sociological element too, that as people start these things, they often continue on. And that's the hope, that you can start a chain of events that somebody wants to do more. And yes, understanding that the finance, the dollar side is a huge problem and a barrier to entry. It's why I think the grant programs are so important, and just the outreach that comes with them. And finding a way to touch those folks, to let them know that there are ways to do this. And we've seen Coastal North Carolina, great example, their grant program on fortified roofs, to really take surplus dollars and put it into mitigation. They tried to, I got to give props, it's there, to shortcut a lot of what took 8 years in Alabama for fortified, they did it in 2. So there are paths, but it is a challenge. And you can kind of hear my voice, I think. It's one of the biggest ones we face.
I'll follow up actually on Chris's suggestion. In one ways, it's a good suggestion, although if you pay for a tree service, it's not a cheap thing, right? To take down a tree that's big enough to cause damage to your house is not going to be a cheap thing to get down unless you're a good do-it-yourselfer and you got enough space to have it fall the opposite direction from the house. But having said that, so one of these people that I met on campus at LSU, there's a professor named Buck Abbey in Landscape Architecture Department. He had done a study in 1992 after Hurricane Andrew hit Louisiana too. People forget that, right? Big damage in Florida, $3 billion damage, a lot of devastation essentially. He had done a study of what tree species performed and what tree species didn't perform. Live oak, you're not going to bother that thing. Doesn't matter where the hurricane came ashore. Water oak, it's coming down, right? And so he had put together and worked with the LSU Ag Center just kind of a small booklet. Hey, these ones are kind of hardy, not going to fall, whatever, these ones weren't. And then he had this brilliant idea, and we tried to get funding, and from several different sources, we wrote a few proposals together, whatever, just never got it funded. He had this idea of, why don't we develop a model landscape ordinance? There's model landscape ordinances, hey, you got to have at least this percentage for drainage, for grass area, for just for aesthetics, whatever. What about a model landscape ordinance that can be localized for what are the appropriate species to plant, especially near buildings? Doesn't matter if it's out in the middle, and how far to plant it from the building and how far to plant it from the power line and which species to use and which species not to use. Simple for new planting, right? So if we get that out there, like that's a no cost, low cost. Don't plant the tree that's going to get too big, whatever, next to the house, or it's going to be a species that's going to fall on that house. That could be low cost when you're building your new house. Oh, let's put in a tree that looks nice or it's going to grow fast, whatever. No, think about what's going to happen when that tree gets big.
Very good. We have like 1 minute, so I need a quick, okay, yes, sir.
Shout out for that. I'm Devin Mack, Texas Tech grad, and I'm a part of the building enclosure community. And I hear your frustration, and I have a simple suggestion. When you set up your committees, what we've found effective is how do you get the information to the grassroots? Target building officials. Go get them. Put them on your committee. Let them hear what you're doing. Let them see the relevance. Get some city officials. Put them on your committees, whether they're involved in that era or not. But it helps so that when they communicate to their fellow officials, it spreads laterally and helps to nudge it forward. But make sure you put some of these people on the committees.
That was one of the biggest successes in coastal Alabama. We had every level of government represented. And I've done a few talks on this, and I had a slide that was a bunch of tree roots showing all these, and you can't do it top down. It does not work that way. And you're exactly right. Looking back at the history of that program, we had 1 or 2 local officials in Baldwin County that actually were the ones who just drove it to the state level. But what also we found was you needed a signal to the builders that this was coming and going to happen. And that's how ultimately, as we sit here today, it got codified, an enhanced code. And we can point out the Moore building code in Oklahoma, same deal. I'm looking at Jim over there. One of the few communities that did something on the tornado. Unfortunately, it just took multiple violent events. You can see my shoulder to get that to go, but it did. And the same thing, there was a period where people wanted to do better. And I remember we did a Weather Brains podcast about this, and we had one of the Moore city officials talking about it, and it's still a challenge for her to maintain it, which actually scares me a lot.
Well, I think you hit on that topic. I mean, there is a window after one of these events that you have to try to impact those local communities and make a change. And that's the window we need to work in, and that's where we can collect the data, and that's where we can back up all these wonderful, resilient ideas that we have. I'd like to thank everyone for coming today. Thank you for attending the entire day. Thank you for your attention to this particular section. It's one that's near and dear to my heart because I live and breathe resilient building every day. So thank you very much, and hope you enjoy the rest of your week.